Hello everyone and welcome to this lecture. We're talking this week about obedience and of course not just any old obedience but political obedience, and this question of obedience is very much linked to the question of authority and legitimacy, because after all, why would you obey something if it wasn't legitimate, right? Although in fairness, we've talked about sovereignty recently as well, and we've said that one of the things that people who talk about sovereignty also often do is they talk about sovereignty in a very thin sense. That is to say, they talk about sovereignty as something that only matters, that for which legitimacy only matters, only to a point until it's contested, right? So that lulls us into a sharp realization, or lures us into a sharp realization then, perhaps, insofar as we in our everyday life tend to think that sovereignty is a fairly legitimate thing. We tend to sort of assume that sovereignty exists because people are very active defenders of their democratic rights, and so sovereignty has to sort of earn our respect. But actually, sovereignty doesn't really care if it earns our respect or not, would be a good response to that, because if you think about it, North Korea, for example, there's a sovereign entity that survives regardless of what the people actually want. But the people are so intimidated and terrified of the regime that they don't feel like revolting. And the sovereign power gets away with it in that instance. Although what we're going to be looking at today in this lecture are instances where that in fact appears not to be true, where uprisings and awakenings have taken place and people have challenged obedience. People have come to realization that the power that faces them is only as powerful as they let it be, that the people have the power, so to speak. And where the people have the power, of course, revolution, and where the people are conscious that they have the power, because of course the people always have the power. The question is, are they conscious of it? And where they can coordinate their efforts across numbers, change does happen, and we have lots of historical evidence of change happening, often when leading experts and people who are paid lots and lots of money by governments or by universities to talk about these things often fail to recognize the writing on the wall, so to speak, which it often is apparent after the fact, but not beforehand. Speaking of which, it would be remiss of me in this lecture not to mention the recent revolts in, basically throughout the world, actually. Some of these revolts were quite intense, and some of them were less intense. For example, in the Western world, in the context of the financial crisis, we had a bit of an outpouring of revolt, but in a minor sense compared to what happened in Egypt, in Greece. Of course, Greece is part of the Western world, but even, I suppose, in Greece it wasn't as bad as it was in Tunisia, Egypt, Syria, of course, and Libya. So this is a question we have to be talking about, I think, and it's a topic that we should be talking about in relation to this week's topic. The question of obedience is intimately linked to recent developments. These recent developments in our world, in our lived experience, in our lived and immediate reality. We have revolt in our midst, and it seems that the virus, if you will, the viral excitement or agitation to get out on the streets and do something about sovereignty mistreating us is very much alive at the moment. And it has been alive in other times in history as well. And the author of this book that I have here on this slide, Paul Mason, he's written a book called Why It's Kicking Off Everywhere, The New Global Revolutions, and I strongly encourage you to read this book if you can. There's a new edition out actually called Why It's Still Kicking Off Everywhere, which is like a 2-year later retrospective on the revolts. And why would I suggest reading this book? Well, Paul Mason is a BBC journalist. He has a lot of experience traveling around the world writing about social movements, and he's very, very aware of the history of social movements. So in his book, he argues that if we want to understand the global revolutions recently, we should go back to Europe of 1848 and the revolutionary wave that took place there in that year, when the Paris Commune was erected, the monarchy was kicked out. And Mason is intimately aware of some of the details of that moment in history and how it set off a wave of protest and sympathetic revolution all across Europe. And again in 1917, something very, very similar happened. So for Mason, this 1848 year is a key moment for our time, which is, of course, starting in 2011. In 1848 in Paris, the workers overthrew the monarchy, and change swept through Austria, Hungary, Poland, Italy, Germany. Now, of course, by 1851, that revolutionary moment was over, but it doesn't, just because it ended and it was not a long-term success, doesn't mean that we shouldn't be paying attention to it, because the causes of that moment in history are very similar to the causes of our own moment in history, from Mason's point of view. He suggests, for example, that today, as then, the revolt was occasioned by a financial crisis. The governments had not seen it coming, either the crisis or the revolt that has responded to that crisis. But here in the United States, for example, and all throughout most of the Western world, we've had a lot of Occupy-style movements: Occupy Wall Street, Occupy London, Occupy Dublin, in Ireland and in Britain, Greece, Spain, Italy. You know, if you're not someone who pays attention to the news, you might not be aware of this. But in 2011 and on through last year as well, really dramatic scenes were seen on the streets of many of our cities. Even in Columbus, Ohio, there was a brief, a very actually long-lived but small outcropping of this Occupy movement. And on the main campus of Ohio University, there was an Occupy Ohio University encampment. So, I mean, there were at the height of this phenomena, tens of thousands of Occupy encampments all over the world. And, that really is something that is quite spectacular. Where does the coordination come from to set up something like that? Well, actually, interestingly, the answer to that question is that there was no coordination. It was a spontaneous phenomena, a self-organizing phenomena, you might call it. That is to say, if you've ever thought about how a Mexican wave works within a football stadium, I don't know if you know what a Mexican wave is, but it's basically a wave where the crowd at one part of the stadium stands up, and then the crowd at the next part of the stadium stands up while the other crowd sits down, and it creates this sort of effect from the opposite side of the stadium, a visual effect of a wave rolling through the crowd, and people participate in this sort of spontaneously. But how do these things get started? It's not clear. Sometimes people start one and nobody participates, in which case the person looks kind of silly. But other times, one or two people might join him, and then maybe a minute later, a few more people might join in, and all of a sudden you have a massive crowd phenomena where everyone's doing it at the same time. And that's kind of what we're talking about here in terms of revolt. How is it that people pick up the baton to take their revolution seriously together? And so it's not just one person standing alone against authority, it's the masses coordinating in this unspoken way, in this uncoordinated way. It's not like anyone is given an order. There's no boss, there's no chief. It's just the masses spontaneously organizing themselves. And that's actually very interesting. That's something that human beings can do from time to time. They can organize themselves horizontally as opposed to vertically, and that's something that we should be taking very, very seriously, I think, that potential. So if we were saying then that the similarities are between then and today are to do with the economic crisis and the fact that the governments didn't see it coming. There's another thing that Paul Mason reminds us is very, very important, and that is what he calls the common denominator, which is graduates without a future. The reality is that today in America, as in most of the world, students today graduating from college will never ever be as wealthy as their parents. The vast majority are going to be less well off. And that is because of the declining material condition of the middle classes in this country and in other Western European countries, for example, as well. This trend is also ongoing in the Middle East, in countries like Tunisia and Libya, where people, the revolution in Tunisia, which started off the Arab Spring, all happened because of a graduate without a future, a young man who was relegated, having, I think, had an engineering degree or a computer science degree, found that he couldn't get a job, and he relegated himself to trying to sell fruit from a fruit stand in a market. But he did not have an easy time of that, and he found it very, very hard to make money, and he got very angry, and he went to the town hall and said, this is ridiculous. I've done everything that society has asked of me. I got my degree. I've worked hard. And now you're seriously telling me that there's no jobs for me? This means that my society is a failure. My society has failed me. I've done my part. The society has not done its part by providing me with a job. And so he set himself on fire. Now, you might say, well, why didn't he go back and find another way to make money or whatever have you? But there's obviously only so much you can do. It's a kind of an American thing sometimes to think that, well, if it's to be, it's up to me, that there's always an option, if only I'm willing to get my hands dirty, etc., etc. But, when you're in a situation where hundreds and hundreds and thousands of people in a city are all looking for work and there's no jobs around, sometimes genuinely that happens, as in the Great Depression in America, which is a major part of American history, where a lot of people were out of work and there were no jobs. Literally, there were no jobs for people to do. So these moments happen, and where they happen, frustration is not an unnatural or unusual occurrence in response. So we need to reckon seriously with that as a reality, and think about what these graduates without a future are going to be doing with themselves. 1848 had graduates without a future as well, and that is the question, right? When you've had a period of time where people have been used to doing well, when they've seen their parents do well. Your parents probably did well throughout the 50s, 60s, 70s in America. That was a glorious time, you might say. The French have a word for it, les 30 glorieuses, the 30 glorious years. The reality is that most of the Western world was thriving and doing quite well in that time, but the wealth dried up, so to speak, and ever since then we've been in decline. The governments used to provide a lot of welfare and services. Those services and that welfare has been declining since the 70s. And people's incomes have been declining too, as companies are finding themselves having to fight for tighter and tighter margins in order to make a profit and to stay in business. That's an interesting sort of contrast for us as well. These things. So we've said a lot there. We've said that the revolt today is a flat revolt, that it's spontaneous, like a Mexican wave. We've said that it's also very similar in some respects to 1848, because it is to do with graduates without a future. And so those are two things that we need to know about then the recent kicking off everywhere global wave of revolt. Now, one thing that can happen in a revolutionary situation, and it's the question that we're asking ourselves about our own time as well, is the potential risk for a counter-revolution. And in the image here, I just have this. I saw this on Facebook the other day, and I thought I'd share it with you. In Tunisia, as I said, that was where the young man burned himself and was demanding jobs. And so one thing that the young man burning himself tells us about the Tunisian situation was that it was a class revolt, right? It was a revolt of the poor, the urban working poor, or the urban unemployed poor, and perhaps some of the middle classes as well. It was the same in Egypt. A lot of these societies are newly technologized. They have industries. There's a lot of people working in sweatshop labor or in factory labor. And there's a new sense of proximity that people have towards each other, right? There's a new sense that people are how should I say, having what I would call in my language, cosmopolitan encounters in the workplace. But what do I mean by cosmopolitan encounters? I mean that there is, for example, in a factory, you'll have people from perhaps different parts of the country that have never met people from those other parts of the country before. So they're having an encounter with difference, but they're finding that despite the fact that they're different, they have something in common. They have the fact that they're working in a factory, that they're earning perhaps subpar wages, that they live in a dictatorship, that their rights are being denied to them, and so this is something that causes people to find common voice, to unify, I think, and It's important that we understand that these revolts don't just come out of nowhere, right? They come through processes of social transformation. And so the factories in Egypt and Tunisia are very indicative here in that case. So the question about counter-revolution then, and of course the woman here on top of the car in this image is saying something that's very, if you will, feminist or progressive. She doesn't want to wear the hijab. The protesters are mostly men, it seems. They want her to wear the hijab. They are young Islamists, and they believe in the revolution, all right, but the vision they have for the revolution is not the vision for the revolution that the workers in the factories had when they started it. It's not the vision that the young man who set himself on fire outside the town hall had when they got started. And it's not necessarily the vision that started the protests in Tahrir Square in Egypt either. Instead, this is a vision that you might say is slightly more middle class. It's not necessarily, of course, the case that it is middle class. A lot of the people, in terms of the actual numbers of people participating in it, but Paul Mason seems to be suggesting that that there is a potential for reaction among the middle classes, and that they are all too happy to ally themselves with, for example, elements of the Muslim Brotherhood, who would like to see the revolution channeled into Islamist values and religious norms being implemented in the society's governing structures. So the workers and the urban poor find themselves on the other side because they're not so interested in religious values. They're interested in putting bread on the table. They're interested in life and living, perhaps with some dignity, some material dignity. And none of these things, the lack of opportunity, the lack of dignity is very important for them as a cause, as an issue. So you can see that also, I think, in the encounter of this woman with these young Muslims on the street. She's obviously expressing a vision that is much more to do with the cause of enablement. She's looking for rights and opportunities to fulfill her life, perhaps materially, perhaps intellectually. She doesn't want to live in a conservative society. And that is the question, is whether now that the revolution released all these opportunities for people to start expressing themselves, whether the revolutionary movement that was started can survive. And if we look at the situation in Egypt now, this is like 2 years later now, right? One of the things that Paul Mason says in a recent piece that he's written, he asks, how well has the prediction of the counter-revolution played out? Well, it's done very well, it seems. 2 years on from the fall of Hosni Mubarak, the new Egyptian president is from the Muslim Brotherhood. On the streets of Cairo, the same kind of people who died in droves in 2011 are still getting killed. On the streets of Athens in Europe, the neo-Nazi party Golden Dawn is staging anti-migrant pogroms. In Russia, the band Pussy Riot are in jail, and the leaders of the democracy movement facing criminal indictments. And the war in Syria is killing 200 people a day. So all of these places, Russia, Syria, Greece, Tunisia, all of these places were revolt or revolutionary tendencies were working in the streets, during the last 2 years or so. So says Paul Mason, or he asks a question. So what have we learned? Did anything change? Is hierarchy returning with a vengeance, or has horizontalism flat revolutionary potential, so to speak? Flat organization of revolutionary potential. Has it achieved anything? And one of the things that he says it has achieved, even though there is this sort of hierarchy returning, as this poor woman in the photograph seems to be experiencing, as the vision she had for the revolution is slipping away from her in Egypt and Tunisia. Mason argues that there has in fact been a powerful and significant change in the consciousness of many, many people all around the world, and that it was a very major movement, and in fact it was one of the first times in human history that we've ever seen anything like this, a major movement. He says the power of social networks has now been effectively battle-tested, and they have been proven. These social networks have been proven powerful, Facebook and Twitter. Without Facebook, without Twitter, without Google, and cell phone text messaging, you would not have had the revolutions in Tunisia or in Egypt. You simply wouldn't have had them. They were organized extensively, relying on Facebook and extensively relying on Twitter in order to become effective. Now, obviously not everyone in those countries has access to those sorts of networks. They don't all have cell phones, and they don't all have computers, and eventually, of course, the regimes cracked down on the access to these networks and made it very, very hard for people to gain access to them. So in the end of the day, you could overstate, you could exaggerate the kind of connectivity, the role that connectivity had in these revolutions. But on the other hand, Paul Mason is adamant in his analysis. He says that regardless of this point, that the build-up to the revolution and the networking that it made possible, these technologies were effectively instrumental in allowing the revolution to take place. So we really can't afford to ignore that point. So where are we now with these questions? The problem is that it looks like, as we've just been saying, that hierarchy might be making a comeback, and horizontalism may not be equipped to deal with the return of hierarchy. The thing about horizontalism, it's originally basically a kind of an anarchistic mode of organizing. It's very flat. There aren't any leaders or bosses, as we were saying. It's self-organizing, and oftentimes it doesn't really make any demands, right? What horizontalism does very well is it gets out on the streets and it demands better democracy. It demands a better process of democracy. It demands a better way that things should be done. But what it's not very good at, because everyone can agree that democracy is good, right? So that's why during the Occupy movement here in the United States, we had everyone from the far left to the libertarians on the right. We had the Lyndon LaRouche crowd. We had the various different libertarian factions represented, anarchists, socialists, you name it, students without a future, as we've been saying. They were all present in the Occupy encampments on Wall Street and in Washington, D.C., and even in Columbus, Ohio. But that is only possible because they were able to achieve consensus. And consensus is actually really relatively easy to achieve sometimes. Certainly if you're only talking about procedure, if you're only talking about the need for a better democracy, then consensus is something that people can really get behind. But what's a lot harder is when you feel you have to start asking for specific demands. So the Occupy movement actually, despite the huge power that it had, despite the massive mobilization of people that it was able to bring out on the streets, it didn't actually ask for anything. It simply modeled in its behavior a kind of an example. It acted as a kind of a teaching moment. It modeled in its behavior an example of how democracy should be done. That everyone should be represented, that there should be as much equal opportunity in the systems of representation as possible. And of course, in that, I think Occupy was a great success because it inspired people to take this kind of idea seriously. But on the other hand, I think that type of horizontalism is only possible in liberal democratic capitalist countries, really, because it's there that the police have to respect standards of behavior. They're not allowed just to go in there and kick butt and crack heads together. At least in theory, they're not. But what we started to see throughout the Middle East, and even in, frankly, in the Western world as well, if you look at Occupy Oakland and how that was put down, if you look at Occupy Wall Street and how that was put down at the end of the day, there was a lot of police violence used there. There's many questions about police violence, police brutality against the protesters there. And the question is, does that kind of behavior have any place from our police force in a liberal country? If we're in a democratic country that subscribes to the classical liberal values of these freedoms of assembly, freedom of protest, then it's not appropriate for the police to be behaving that way. So it looks like hierarchy is making a comeback, right? Hierarchy is saying, no, we can have democracy, but not that type of democracy, right? It's, as I might say jokingly, it's the Meatloaf approach to democracy. There's a famous Meatloaf song, I would do anything for love, but I won't do that. Of course, this is the democratic version of that song. I would do anything for democracy, but I won't do that. I won't allow the Occupy protests to take place, even though they were not violent and even though they were not causing any harm in the greater scale of things. They were a lot of students and young people and unemployed people and people from various different political movements calling for greater democracy, and that in the context of a financial crisis that had left all these, as we've been saying, graduates without a future, clearly feeling alienated and worried and concerned about their student debt, worried about the so-called 99% versus the 1%, the 1% having huge amount of the money in the country. Something like 90% of all the wealth is owned by the top 10% of Americans. I know enough about this to know that and we'll go back to these numbers. I'll give you more precise figures later in the year here, later in the semester. But there's huge inequity between the top and the bottom in American society today, and while people Mitt Romney might say that that's not really that much of an issue for him, it unfortunately is an issue for most people who are struggling to pay their student loans and survive on a modest income. So the question we were raising, though I got diverted there, the question we were raising is, so what happens if hierarchy comes back? And what Paul Mason is saying is that, well, given that anarchist tactics, that horizontalism only works in a sort of a liberal society where people have rights and police have to respect those rights, then these sorts of horizontalist tactics, will thrive there. But if the police get orders not to respect those rights, if new laws are introduced where the police don't have to respect those rights, then obviously things can change, and will change in such a way that naturally the people who are protesting will have to resort to different tactics, and you might find eventually that they get frustrated and they themselves start using violence where they haven't been using violence to date. So that's a little sort of snapshot of what's going on right now in the world of anarchist politics and street politics. But to start thinking now about the main theme of our lecture, which is obedience, we want to ask about this Mexican wave phenomena that I was talking about earlier on, this spontaneous self-organizing wave that you sometimes see in a football stadium. How is it that people sometimes break out of that? Well, I think first of all we have to understand how it is that people come to obey. Where does that come from? And the potential that you and I even, maybe as ordinary people, have to obey. Sometimes we obey very strange and disturbing rules. So in our society, for example, it's often a question about the extent to which we are complicit in acts of our government or acts of our society and community that might be problematic. And the fact that many of us just go along on a day-to-day basis, respecting these rules, respecting these ways of behaving or patterns of behavior in our society, is an indication that many of us aren't always awake. Many of us aren't always fully awake, thinking about the kinds of choices that we have and the kinds of options we have at our disposal, and the kinds of involvement and responsibilities we have to think about. So if we're talking about obedience, then where does obedience come from? What we've just been saying basically is that people aren't always conscious of the fact that they're obeying. Sometimes they're just going along with things, and they're not really thinking about, oh, well, is this a good idea or a bad idea? I'm just stuffing letters in an envelope here. It's my job. I guess I'll just do that job and not think about what's going into the envelopes. Am I okay with that? Am I not okay with it? And this is a problem, right? Because it means that sometimes we're doing things in very ordinary ways, but those ordinary things that we're doing can have aggregate effects that are very bad, that have really negative impact on people's actual lives. So we could ask ourselves then, in that case, is our obedience always a good thing? One example of everyday ordinary actions sort of over time adding up to be a series of terrible actions, of course, is revealed by the example of the trial of Adolf Eichmann. And Adolf Eichmann, of course, was a logistician and a master figure in orchestrating the Jewish Holocaust during World War II on the side of the Nazis. And when he was taken to trial after World War II, he was detained, and I think he was put on trial in Israel. One of the survivors of that Holocaust, a woman by the name of Hannah Arendt, who was actually a philosopher, went to Israel to see these trials, the Eichmann trial. And what she observed there left her kind of disturbed and surprised. She realized that, the man before her looked like a very ordinary man. He also, during the conflict, hadn't really himself personally really killed any Jews. Rather, this is of someone who used to just sort of get up and go to work in the morning with a suitcase, put on his suit and tie, and he would sit in an office all day long and he would look at train timetables. And, he's a central figure in the Holocaust, but all he did every day was look at train timetables. So how do you figure, how is it that one of the greatest evils that's ever been perpetrated in modern history, that the person at the center of all of this is guilty indeed of being a major figure in this Holocaust? But what was it that he actually did to contribute to that Holocaust? He organized the trains. He organized the movement of people to and fro. And Hannah Arendt was really struck by this. She was thinking, well, my gosh, these are very ordinary. This is a very ordinary everyday activity, organizing train timetables. But yet, it in this instance led to a tremendously evil phenomena. And so that leads her at the end of her argument about the Eichmann trial to reflect on what she calls the banality of evil, which means basically the everydayness of evil, the ordinary everydayness of evil, and it makes her pause and question, well, how many of us are doing things on ordinary things in an ordinary everyday way, and we just don't think about what they add up to, right? I mean, we don't think about the fact that our ordinary everyday activities, which seem so normal, right, can actually add up over time to have these hugely negative impacts for other people, or perhaps even for ourselves down the road. So when later a man by the name of Stanley Milgram, who was a psychologist, read Hannah Arendt's writings about the Adolf Eichmann trial, he was very curious. And he decided to set up an experiment that would try to evaluate an interesting question. Is it just that the Germans and the Japanese were uniquely susceptible to the going along with evil in an ordinary everyday way? Or is it possible that even Americans and Irish and British people would be susceptible to going along with rules in an ordinary everyday way? What was the thing that was making people go along with these evil acts and thinking that somehow it was all just part of their job or part, just nothing special? So he set up an experiment, and he invited people in off the street at his university to participate in the experiment. And the experiment was set up as it's shown in the slide here on the screen, that you would have an evaluator, or a so-called experimenter, who's the figure in authority. And you'd have behind the at last screen, you'd have a subject, right, hooked up to a so-called electric chair, but the person would really be an actor, okay? The person wasn't really hooked up to an electric chair, but to the people coming in off the street, it appeared as if they were looking at someone hooked up to an electric chair. And they were asked to help run an experiment where the man, he had a clipboard, he had a formal badge, and he was wearing a white lab coat. He would get the person off the street to sit down and ask the person in the electric chair a series of questions. And if the person got the question right, there would be no electricity. But if the person got the question wrong, a increasing voltage of electricity would be applied. So every time they would get a question wrong, more and more and more electricity would be applied. And so what that means at the end of the day is that if the person kept getting questions wrong, the actor, in other words, kept getting questions wrong, that in theory more electricity and more electricity would be being applied. And so the actor, of course, would start screaming out in pain, oh my god, like it hurts, you're killing me, this is so harmful, blah 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 blah. The question is, how far along with this experiment would this person coming in off the street go? And what Stanley Milgram found out, to his astonishment, was that a huge number of people were willing to go up to very, very painful levels of electricity. And the question is why? Why were people willing to do that? Well, because they had signed a waiver when they came in that basically gave them indemnity. And so they could say, well, look, I signed away my responsibility here, so I'm clearly not responsible. It's the person giving the orders that's responsible. I'm just carrying out orders. And there you go, says Milgram. That's the rub. And it is a fact that Americans, Germans, Japanese, Irish, Australians, you name it, are all equally susceptible to this kind of logic or this kind of argument as anyone else. And so we are human beings, that is to say, perhaps we are very obedient creatures most of the time, especially when it comes to ordinary everyday things. And certainly people will vary, people will resist obedience from time to time, but it's not clear that they do that all the time or how often they will do that. In fact, I think the historical evidence suggests that they tend to obey much more often than they tend to disobey. And of course there's reasons for that, because oftentimes disobedience comes at tremendous personal cost. Like, if you disobey a police officer, you get in a lot of trouble, right? So we are in a society throughout the Western world. I think we live in societies that are generally very respectful of those in authority, for better or for worse. But oftentimes, because we are thinking in the long term about our own survival, and that's entirely legitimate, by the way. Of course, we need to do that. But obedience over time has consequences. If the Milgram experiments raise the question of how obedience is maintained, obviously sometimes it is indeed, as we've been saying, automatic. But what about when our automatic nature is disrupted? What about, as we see here, these famous Kent State University shootings in 1970 here in Ohio? The question is, how does authority respond? And of course here, as we know, authority responded very, very violently, and several students lost their lives on the campus grounds. And much to the horror of people involved and to the nation, the use of brute police force was present in this instance. So authority has a lot of different options for dealing with us, of course. It can use propaganda, it can use the police force. Generally, of course, we imagine the police are constrained by the law and may not use disproportionate force in engaging with, for example, protesters who are simply just engaging in civil disobedience and not being violent. But but the police, when they use force, have a problem, right? Because if they do decide to use disproportionate force, they may end up bumping up against the limits of the patience of the public. And the public may say, well, hang on a minute, that's not appropriate. And so they may actually end up doing something counterproductive. If the police are engaging in forceful behavior and the public reject that behavior, the police may have actually damaged their own cause, because instead of creating more order, what they've actually done is they've further undermined order, as the public are now restive and they're protesting out on the streets. So incidents like this, the Kent state shootings, generated widespread public support and certainly hurt the argument of the powers that be that they were behaving in a legitimate manner. Many people were upset and indeed became activists after seeing these photos of this event. Let's just do a time check here.